Good evening. Welcome to our special event tonight. I'm so impressed that you all came out on such short notice because we just put this together within the past 30 hours or so. I was approached yesterday by our editorial management, said, do we think we could do this? Would you be interested in it? And I jumped at the opportunity. I'm Larry Mantle, by the way, in case you didn't recognize the voice. Maybe you're not a KPCC listener. By the end of tonight, I hope you will be if you're not, but great to have you here. How many of you have been here before for one of our events? Great, just about almost half of you, I say. That's terrific. Well, those of you who are here for the first time, I hope you see what a great venue this is for all kinds of events that are done, some of them broadcast, most of them not, so the only way to take advantage of them is to come and visit our forum regularly. You'll see all the events, kpcc.org/forum. So here's what we're going to do tonight. We are going to watch together President Obama give his address to the nation. We're not sure exactly how long that's going to last. We'll watch that live. It's scheduled to start 1 minute from now. And then afterwards, I'll come back up with two local scholars who are going to share their differing views on what the appropriate U.S. response should be to the alleged use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government. So it's going to be a good conversation with them, I'm sure. And then I'd love to have a few of you. Obviously, we can't take a lot of questions from audience members, but I'd like to take a few of you, have you come on up and take part in the conversation. I'm also expecting 4 to 5 members of Congress will be joining us on the phone tonight. For obvious reasons, they won't be here physically. They're in D.C. But they'll be on the line to share their response to what the president has to say. So that's going to be among the first comments you'll be hearing from members of the Southern California congressional delegation, what they have to say about this. So again, thank you for coming out. Please silence your cell phones if you would, so we don't pick it up, because we are live streaming. Now the president.
My fellow Americans, tonight I want to talk to you about Syria, why it matters, and where we go from here. Over the past 2 years, what began as a series of peaceful protests against the repressive regime of Bashar al-Assad has turned into a brutal civil war. Over 100,000 people have been killed. Millions have fled the country. In that time, America has worked with allies to provide humanitarian support, to help the moderate opposition, and to shape a political settlement. But I have resisted calls for military action because we cannot resolve someone else's civil war through force, particularly after a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The situation profoundly changed, though, on August 21st, when Assad's government gassed to death over 1,000 people, including hundreds of children. The images from this massacre are sickening. Men, women, children lying in rows, killed by poison gas. Others foaming at the mouth, gasping for breath. A father clutching his dead children, imploring them to get up and walk. On that terrible night, the world saw in gruesome detail the terrible nature of chemical weapons, and why the overwhelming majority of humanity has declared them off limits, a crime against humanity, and a violation of the laws of war. This was not always the case. In World War I, American GIs were among the many thousands killed by deadly gas in the trenches of Europe. In World War II, the Nazis used gas to inflict the horror of the Holocaust. Because these weapons can kill on a mass scale, with no distinction between soldier and infant, the civilized world has spent a century working to ban them. And in 1997, the United States Senate overwhelmingly approved an international agreement prohibiting the use of chemical weapons, now joined by 189 governments that represent 98% of humanity. On August 21st, these basic rules were violated, along with our sense of common humanity. No one disputes that chemical weapons were used in Syria. The world saw thousands of videos, cell phone pictures, and social media accounts from the attack. And humanitarian organizations told stories of hospitals packed with people who had symptoms of poison gas. Moreover, we know the Assad regime was responsible. In the days leading up to August 21st, we know that Assad's chemical weapons personnel prepared for an attack near an area where they mix sarin gas. They distributed gas masks to their troops. Then they fired rockets from a regime-controlled area into 11 neighborhoods that the regime has been trying to wipe clear of opposition forces. Shortly after those rockets landed, the gas spread, and hospitals filled with the dying and the wounded. We know senior figures in Assad's military machine reviewed the results of the attack, and the regime increased their shelling of the same neighborhoods in the days that followed. We've also studied samples of blood and hair from people at the site that tested positive for sarin. When dictators commit atrocities, they depend upon the world to look the other way until those horrifying pictures fade from memory. But these things happened. The facts cannot be denied. The question now is what the United States of America and the international community is prepared to do about it. Because what happened to those people, to those children, is not only a violation of international law, it's also a danger to our security. Let me explain why. If we fail to act, the Assad regime will see no reason to stop using chemical weapons. As the ban against these weapons erodes, other tyrants will have no reason to think twice about acquiring poison gas and using them. Over time, our troops would again face the prospect of chemical warfare on the battlefield, and it could be easier for terrorist organizations to obtain these weapons and to use them to attack civilians. If fighting spills beyond Syria's borders, these weapons could threaten allies like Turkey, Jordan, and Israel. And a failure to stand against the use of chemical weapons would weaken prohibitions against other weapons of mass destruction and embolden Assad's ally, Iran, which must decide whether to ignore international law by building a nuclear weapon or to take a more peaceful path. This is not a world we should accept. This is what's at stake. And that is why, after careful deliberation, I determined that it is in the national security interests of the United States to respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike. The purpose of this strike would be to deter Assad from using chemical weapons, to degrade his regime's ability to use them, and to make clear to the world that we will not tolerate their use. That's my judgment as Commander-in-Chief. But I'm also the President of the world's oldest constitutional democracy. So even though I possess the authority to order military strikes, I believed it was right, in the absence of a direct or imminent threat to our security, to take this debate to Congress. I believe our democracy is stronger when the President acts with the support of Congress. And I believe that America acts more effectively abroad when we stand together. This is especially true after a decade that put more and more war-making power in the hands of the President and more burdens on the shoulders of our troops while sidelining the people's representatives from the critical decisions about when we use force. Now, I know that after the terrible toll of Iraq and Afghanistan, the idea of any military action, no matter how limited, is not going to be popular. After all, I've spent 4.5 years working to end wars, not to start them. Our troops are out of Iraq. Our troops are coming home from Afghanistan. And I know Americans want all of us in Washington, especially me, to concentrate on the task of building our nation here at home, putting people back to work, educating our kids, growing our middle class. It's no wonder then that you're asking hard questions. So let me answer some of the most important questions that I've heard from members of Congress and that I've read in letters that you've sent to me. First, many of you have asked, won't this put us on a slippery slope to another war? One man wrote to me that we are still recovering from our involvement in Iraq. A veteran put it more bluntly. This nation is sick and tired of war. My answer is simple. I will not put American boots on the ground in Syria. I will not pursue an open-ended action like Iraq or Afghanistan. I will not pursue a prolonged air campaign like Libya or Kosovo. This would be a targeted strike to achieve a clear objective: deterring the use of chemical weapons and degrading Assad's capabilities. Others have asked whether it's worth acting if we don't take out Assad. As some members of Congress have said, there's no point in simply doing a pinprick strike in Syria. Let me make something clear. The United States military doesn't do pinpricks. Even a limited strike will send a message to Assad that no other nation can deliver. I don't think we should remove another dictator with force. We learned from Iraq that doing so makes us responsible for all that comes next. But a targeted strike can make Assad, or any other dictator, think twice before using chemical weapons. Other questions involve the dangers of retaliation. We don't dismiss any threats, but the Assad regime does not have the ability to seriously threaten our military. Any other retaliation they might seek is in line with threats that we face every day. Neither Assad nor his allies have any interest in escalation that would lead to his demise. And our ally Israel can defend itself with overwhelming force, as well as the unshakable support of the United States of America. Many of you have asked a broader question. Why should we get involved at all in a place that's so complicated, and where, as one person wrote to me, those who come after Assad may be enemies of human rights? It's true that some of Assad's opponents are extremists, but al-Qaeda will only draw strength in a more chaotic Syria if people there see the world doing nothing to prevent innocent civilians from being gassed to death. The majority of the Syrian people and the Syrian opposition we work with just want to live in peace, with dignity and freedom. And the day after any military action, we would redouble our efforts to achieve a political solution that strengthens those who reject the forces of tyranny and extremism. Finally, many of you have asked, why not leave this to other countries or seek solutions short of force? As several people wrote to me, we should not be the world's policeman. I agree, and I have a deeply held preference for peaceful solutions. Over the last 2 years, my administration has tried diplomacy and sanctions, warnings and negotiations, but chemical weapons were still used by the Assad regime. However, over the last few days, we've seen some encouraging signs. In part because of the credible threat of U.S. military action, as well as constructive talks that I had with President Putin, the Russian government has indicated a willingness to join with the international community in pushing Assad to give up his chemical weapons. The Assad regime has now admitted that it has these weapons, and even said they joined the Chemical Weapons Convention, which prohibits their use. It's too early to tell whether this offer will succeed, and any agreement must verify that the Assad regime keeps its commitments. But this initiative has the potential to remove the threat of chemical weapons without the use of force, particularly because Russia is one of Assad's strongest allies. I have therefore asked the leaders of Congress to postpone a vote to authorize the use of force while we pursue this diplomatic path. I'm sending Secretary of State John Kerry to meet his Russian counterpart on Thursday, and I will continue my own discussions with President Putin. I've spoken to the leaders of two of our closest allies, France and the United Kingdom, and we will work together in consultation with Russia and China to put forward a resolution at the UN Security Council requiring Assad to give up his chemical weapons and to ultimately destroy them under international control. We'll also give UN inspectors the opportunity to report their findings about what happened on August 21st. And we will continue to rally support from allies from Europe to the Americas, from Asia to the Middle East, who agree on the need for action. Meanwhile, I've ordered our military to maintain their current posture, to keep the pressure on Assad, and to be in a position to respond if diplomacy fails. And tonight I give thanks again to our military and their families for their incredible strength and sacrifices. My fellow Americans, for nearly 7 decades, the United States has been the anchor of global security. This has meant doing more than forging international agreements. It has meant enforcing them. The burdens of leadership are often heavy, but the world's a better place because we have borne them. And so, to my friends on the right, I ask you to reconcile your commitment to America's military might with a failure to act when a cause is so plainly just. To my friends on the left, I ask you to reconcile your belief in freedom and dignity for all people with those images of children writhing in pain and going still on a cold hospital floor. For sometimes resolutions and statements of condemnation are simply not enough. Indeed, I'd ask every member of Congress and those of you watching at home tonight to view those videos of the attack and then ask, what kind of world will we live in if the United States of America sees a dictator brazenly violate international law with poison gas and we choose to look the other way? Franklin Roosevelt once said, "Our national determination to keep free of foreign wars and foreign entanglements cannot prevent us from feeling deep concern when ideals and principles that we have cherished are challenged." Our ideals and principles, as well as our national security, are at stake in Syria, along with our leadership of a world where we seek to ensure that the worst weapons will never be used. America's not the world's policeman. Terrible things happen across the globe, and it is beyond our means to right every wrong. But when, with modest effort and risk, we can stop children from being gassed to death and thereby make our own children safer over the long run, I believe we should act. That's what makes America different. That's what makes us exceptional. With humility, but with resolve, let us never lose sight of that essential truth. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
We're going to bring our guests up here to begin our conversation, but I want to get your immediate response before you hear us talk about it and analyze it. How many of you thought the president made a compelling case? You were impressed with what he had to say? All right. And that may not necessarily mean you support the decision he wants to take, but you still felt it was a strong argument and that he did a good job addressing the country. All right, very good. We're going to hear from our 2 panelists. I'll introduce them momentarily, and we'll get you into the conversation, as well as our local members of Congress coming up as well. So let me introduce our guests. Right next to me is Edwin Smith, USC Professor of Law, International Relations, Political Science. He was appointed by President Clinton to be a policy advisor for the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Professor Smith, we welcome you. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And also with us, Professor Robert Kaufman of Pepperdine University. International policy is his area of expertise. He's professor of public policy. He previously taught at the Naval War College, and he wrote an op-ed piece for the Orange County Register last week titled "The Hawkish Case for Syrian Inaction." So we'll hear what he has to say about that as well. Let me begin with the two of you and start with you, Professor Kaufman. You heard the president's speech. What did you think of the arguments that he made? Did you think that they were clearly and strongly presented?
I understand his case, but I think there's an inherent contradiction in what he proposes to do. If you're really serious about being credible and sending a signal about chemical weapons, his willingness to respond is underwhelming to the problem. I use his own words, a controlled, tailored response, not designed to go after the Assad regime. I believe that the likelihood of an ineffective use of force is going to be more deleterious on the cause he seeks to serve and on Iranian calculations. If you look at the history of ineffective uses of force from the Bay of Pigs to graduated escalation in Vietnam, to the debacle in the desert, to withdrawing from Somalia after the fight in Mogadishu, that is the recipe to invite miscalculation. So, however tragic the situation is in Syria, President Obama's response will be underwhelming, and sadly it will make things worse rather than better.
And we'll get to what the consequences of inaction would potentially be. And Professor Smith, maybe you want to talk about that. And I assume you thought the president made a strong case tonight?
I think the president made the case that I would have made for exactly the reasons I would have made the same case. I agree with the argument that there needs to be some response. There may not be an overwhelming response possible. There may not be a perfect response possible, but I believe that the violation of the taboo against chemical weapons on this scale and this context must have a response. That response may not necessarily be full-on military force. It may not involve military force at all. But an effective response, an attempt at an effective response is called for in this situation.
Let me ask, how many of you think that public opinion polls will show some kind of a bump for President Obama in supporting military action if this diplomatic endeavor with Russia doesn't work? How many of you think more people will support military action? Just a few of you. So, well, more of you. Okay. Think that people will be moved by this speech. He's got a huge challenge, though, with American public opinion, with Congress. Clearly, there are a lot of members who are undecided, many who are against it. So can he do this without that support?
Well, I think the point that needs to be made over and over and over again, anybody who has studied diplomacy knows that to get movement in diplomacy, you frequently need the threat of force to move things forward. That is an absolutely classic argument. Going back to Bismarck, one of the most pernicious people you can talk about in history, there have been many books written about the relationship between diplomacy and force. The threat of force moves diplomacy forward. I think John Kerry was very articulate today when he talked about, I think it was Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson, who said that the prospect of hanging focuses the mind. And the prospect of hanging has focused Assad's mind.
Well, and that gets to the question of whether it really has done so. They agreed today to join with the chemical weapons ban and agreed to turn over his full chemical weapons arsenal. Professor Kaufman, do you believe that?
No, I don't. And when you talk about the relationship between force and diplomacy, an adjective here is critical. It's the credible use of force. If you were serious, and I wrote this in an editorial, and you're not talking to someone who's averse to using force. I'm the author of In Defense of the Bush Doctrine. I'm for using force when it's decisive. But in this particular case, if you were serious and don't want to undermine American credibility, Bing West in the National Review laid out a plan that you would have to ground the Syrian Air Force and bomb Syrian airfields to prevent the Iranians and the Russians from resupply. If, however, you are going to use force merely as a symbol, people are not going to take us seriously. I don't argue that not using force is a good option. What I am arguing is that of three bad options, using force ineffectively is the worst of the three options on the table, and that's exactly what the president intends to do by his own words.
Well, the only option I've heard described as a good option is if this diplomatic one works. But you think that's a farce.
Actually,
That's not-
I disagree with you. I don't think the diplomatic option can work, given the dismal history of the United Nations involved in this, the veto system, the matter of timing. This is a way for Putin and Assad to consolidate Assad's regime. It's not a serious offer that will affect things on the ground.
Okay, so but I was trying to qualify those who thought that the diplomatic option actually had a shot. Professor Smith, you think there is a chance this diplomatic thing could work?
I think we are seeing moves that we haven't been able to see before. We are seeing Russia take a position that it has been totally unwilling to take. At least they are talking about the possibility of getting Syria to change positions, and they are at least suggesting the possibility. That is a sea change. That is a different position than Russia has been taking for the last 2 years. I'm not saying that we have a complete answer, but we have movement that we haven't seen before, and in order to determine whether or not it's effective movement, we have to test it.
Well, here's though what President Putin said today in an interview, subject to the accuracy of the translation into English. He said, all of this will only mean anything if the United States and other nations supporting it tell us that they're giving up their plan to use force against Syria. You can't really ask Syria or any other country to disarm unilaterally while military action against it is being contemplated. Now, that's obviously fraught with a number of problems. First of all, he's equating unilateral disarmament with giving up one's chemical weapons. So if Russia is going to be the broker of this, and that's the view of its president, where does the U.S. go from there?
I think what we are witnessing is the consequence of public negotiations. That's why most diplomatic negotiations are public, because every position everyone takes gets to be reflective of the character of the entity taking the position. Anybody who's been involved in negotiations knows that people take opposite positions and then move toward a middle.
So you think that was just, he was just, that was a negotiating ploy. He doesn't really believe it. Well, I'll come back to you on that, Professor Kaufman, but let me introduce Democratic member of Congress Adam Schiff, who represents Burbank, Glendale, and surrounding communities. He's a member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Congressman Schiff, thank you for being with us. Appreciate your talking to our audience here at KPCC.
You bet. Good to be with you.
So you've had a chance to hear the president. I know you've been in a number of high-profile and important meetings about this. Where do you stand?
Well, I think the Russian offer is a very encouraging and positive development for a couple of reasons. It may have been a shrewd gambit by the Russians, but the fact that it was shrewd for them doesn't mean that it wouldn't be wise for us to accept. Our key interest, I think, from a humanitarian point of view, is making sure Assad doesn't use chemical weapons again. But the core of our national security interest is making sure that those chemical weapons stockpiles don't fall in the wrong hands. And when the Assad regime does fall, there's a real risk that those weapons could be obtained by al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, al-Nusra, or some other terrorist organization. And putting them under UN supervision and ultimately UN destruction is the best way to safeguard that core security interest of ours. And that's something that a military strike would not accomplish. So I think this is positive, obviously very complex to orchestrate in the middle of a civil war. And we'll be testing whether the Russians are serious about it. But even if they weren't, I think it'd be in our interest to make them serious about it.
So if you were responding to the roll call vote today, you had to come down on this, which way would you vote?
Well, I think the president's wise not to call for a vote, particularly in light of this development. I don't think members of Congress would be willing to support a strike when there's a diplomatic opportunity to resolve this. And as the president said, and Secretary Kerry, this really needs to be run to the ground. So I think it was wise for the president to postpone it. It may also have been necessary. The public has not yet been won over on this. We haven't won the support of many international allies. and the vote in the House looked very precarious. So I think it was wise to put it off, and I don't think it would have had the support it would need to pass, particularly in light of this offer if it had been taken up today.
If the members of the Security Council agreed to a resolution which would tie the disarmament, the chemical disarmament of Syria, with an underlying enforcement mechanism of possible military strikes or some serious form of enforcement, would it then be up to the Congress to vote to authorize that possible enforcement tool? Would the president need to come to you?
Well, the president, I think, would need to come to us whenever he entertained using force here. I think he's already made that clear. So whether there was backing in the UN or there wasn't, I think it would be necessary to come to the Congress. I do think that the president made the right decision in seeking to see if we can implement this with Russia prior to taking it up for a vote. It's conceivable they may change course and ask for a resolution that says we'll give the Syrians and Russians time, but if they don't make good on their offer, then I want the authorization now. But I think probably the wiser course for the administration is the one the president outlined tonight.
So you don't think if Congress were to vote to authorize the president to use force, that would give the U.S. a stronger negotiating position on a resolution with the Security Council?
I think it would give us a stronger negotiating position. I think that's true. But I think the American people are very wary of giving the executive, even an executive they trust, the authority to decide at any given point that they want to use military force in the midst of a civil war. So my guess is that the public would want Congress to keep a tight rein on this. And that's, I think, the reason why it may be difficult to get that authorization in advance.
You mentioned that if the Assad regime fell or when it falls, you'd be concerned about what happens to the chemical weapons stockpiles. But as to the regime itself, what the president was just talking about were targeted strikes not aimed at removing Assad from power. So do you think that should be a priority, that the U.S. should try and get Assad out? Is Assad the lesser of two evils, as terrible as he is to his people, that the U.S. interest might be hurt by having some sort of an extremist government that takes his place? Where do you come down on that?
Well, I do think that we have the right policy, and that is the policy that Assad must go. The question is, how do we implement that, and to what degree do we want to get involved in the Syrian civil war to make that happen? I've been one of the few voices within the intelligence committees to oppose arming the rebels because that I fear would entangle us in the civil war. You provide some arms and it's not enough to turn the tide, then you have to provide more arms, and if that's not enough, you're asked to provide more sophisticated arms. And I don't want to go down that road. So I think we support the secular opposition. We can do that in a non-military way. If others want to support the secular opposition militarily, that's their decision, and there are others who do. At the same time, I think we ought to do everything possible to meet the humanitarian needs of the refugees. And you're right, this is all fraught with some peril. And particularly if there were a precipitous fall of the Assad regime, there could be chaos in Syria. But I will say this, and I don't think that what the president proposed would bring about the end of the regime overnight. But it's interesting that it was enough to bring the Russians to the table, and I think only that credible threat of force brought the Russians to the table. So they obviously do fear that our military action could tip the balance on the battlefield. The Russians have opposed us in the UN and opposed even the most anodyne resolutions condemning the use of chemical weapons in Syria without even ascribing blame to the Assad regime. So something motivated the Russians to change course, and I think it was the credible threat of force and the concern they had that Assad might fall.
Congressman Schiff, thanks so much. We appreciate your talking with us from Washington tonight.
You bet. Good to talk with you.
Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat from the 28th District, including Glendale, Burbank, Los Feliz, and surrounding communities. Professor Kaufman, do you think that Russia is concerned that if the U.S. takes military action, the Assad government will fall?
No, and I disagree entirely about the Russians doing this because they feared President Obama. Quite the contrary. President Obama went into this dynamic with very little leverage. Think about it. The Congress doesn't support him. The American right, which historically is more robust about the use of force, doesn't support him. The international community doesn't support him. He couldn't even get Great Britain to support him. The first time since World War II, the British have departed. President Obama has entered this endeavor with a grand coalition of two, including as our only ally, the French. When you're bringing the French as your only ally to an endeavor like this does not convey resolution, but weakness. I actually think this plan of Putin's is not a serious plan. It's a plan of consolidating Assad's power. We're quoting Samuel Johnson a lot tonight, so let me add one. Relying on Putin, relying on the United Nations, is what Johnson calls a second marriage, a triumph of hope over experience. This is a gambit rather than a serious proposal.
As someone who has a great second marriage, I don't know about that. So how many of you agree with Congressman Schiff's perspective that you think that Russia got involved, made this overture because it's concerned about U.S. military action? All right. So a handful of you, but Congressman Schiff's position on that doesn't seem by any means to be the majority on that. Let me go to the slippery slope argument and ask you about that, Professor Smith, because the president directly addressed that. A lot of Americans have concerns that this could end up in another conflict like in Iraq. And I think some of the people who feel that way sort of see this both ways, that if you say you're not going to do boots on the ground, it's only going to be a limited response, you're almost ensuring it's not going to be effective. Then on the same hand, that at some point you're probably going to be forced to go in if things get bad enough there. How do you think that slippery slope could be avoided?
I think that slippery slope is difficult to avoid because if we do nothing, we may very, very well find ourselves under pressure to do more. The slippery slope is there, and it's not affected necessarily by the choice to go with response now. The slippery slope will be there. The danger of Syria is not going away. Now, the question is, does our use of force make that slope steeper? If we were talking about solely using force, I would be more concerned than thinking about using the threat of force
To leverage
diplomacy.
All right.
That's what I support.
We also have with us Republican member of Congress John Campbell, who represents coastal Orange County. Congressman, thank you for joining us tonight.
Hi, Larry. Good to be with you.
I really appreciate it. So you had a chance to hear what the president had to say. What were your initial impressions? Were you impressed, or did it fall flat with you?
Well, at first, I'm sure I think you know this, but your listeners should know I've been opposed to this, to military involvement in this conflict in Syria, and frankly been opposed to our continued involvement in Afghanistan since the surge. And so tonight, when the president spoke, I was looking to see whether it would change my mind, and I didn't hear any new information, and I actually, frankly, didn't hear any new arguments. It was in a slightly different package, but I was unmoved by it.
What for you is the biggest drawback against the U.S. taking military action? What keeps you a consistent no vote?
The risks of a wider conflict. The president talks about the chemical weapons usage. One of the things he didn't mention in the usage of chemical weapons was it was used in the Iran-Iraq war back in the 80s, which went on for, 5 years or 7 years or something like that. We didn't engage in that. We didn't get involved in that. That was actually a cross-national border, obviously, war involving some major military assets and so forth. And, our national security as a country, I don't think, was necessarily weakened by our non-involvement in that conflict. this conflict, to me, in Syria has all the markings of something that could grow into something much larger because of our involvement. We don't know how the Russians will respond, how Assad will respond, how the Iranians will respond, how anybody in that area will respond. And what is currently a civil war contained completely within the country of Syria could spill over across borders, and then we've got a problem. And I always remind people in 1914 that a Serbian assassinated an Austrian archduke, and a few months later, Germany and Britain declared war on each other. These things can spread, and this one really worries me that it would spread.
So if the U.S. doesn't take action and this diplomatic effort doesn't bear fruit, Syria doesn't fully disarm of chemical weapons, what do you think is likely to result from that? What are there going to be further uses of them? Will this embolden other regimes, other dictators, whether it's nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or even biological warfare at some point?
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily emboldens, for example, the Iranians or others regarding nuclear and other weapons. But, is there a risk if we don't do anything, he uses chemical weapons again? Sure. But is there a risk if we do something that actually encourages him to use chemical weapons again in an even more massive way? Because these are not rational actors over there. These are not reasonable, rational people, and they will do things that aren't even in their own interest just because they're angry. And so that's amongst the things I think we have to be careful about. And whether chemical weapons are used or not, you heard the president point out this evening, 100,000 people have been killed in this civil war, and he was unmoved by that. Then somewhere less than 1,000 are killed in a chemical attack where our intelligence says they have a high degree of assurance, but they can't be certain was even done by the Assad regime, and then we're supposed to move in. Even if the chemical weapons go away through diplomatic or some other solution, and this war goes on, another 100,000 people could probably be killed by conventional means. And I'm not saying we should intervene. I'm not using that as an argument for that. I'm just saying that I don't know why the chemical weapons on a few hundred or 1,000 people is that much greater a crime against humanity than killing 100,000 people through various other ways.
So do you disagree then with the chemical weapons ban? Do you disagree with the UN saying this is fundamentally different than conventional warfare?
No, I don't, but let's remember that this is still relatively new. Again, as the president pointed out tonight, the United States had a substantial chemical weapons stockpile until we decided to dismantle it in 1997. So only 16 years ago, we had chemical weapons and had the ability to use them if we wanted to. And in fact, they were used in a lot of military training things and had been for decades prior to that. So this is a relatively new thing. I just don't quite understand why there are all kinds of atrocities that happen around the world and in greater numbers, and those don't require any action, but this one particular one does. And as I pointed out, chemical weapons were used in the Iraq-Iran war.
Okay.
We didn't do anything, we didn't respond, and there hasn't been a use of them since. So just because we don't send missiles in the case of something like this, doesn't mean it's going to repeat itself.
Yeah, I don't mean to be picky about something you said earlier, but you said the president was unmoved by the 100,000. I assume you meant that he wasn't calling for military action, not that he wasn't moved by the loss of. I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. I didn't mean he was emotionally unmoved. Obviously,
Yes,
everyone is emotionally moved by all of these, but I mean he was not moved towards military action as a result of the 100,000 killed before.
So, Congressman, do you think that this is going to make its way back to the House for a vote to be held on this? Where do you think this is going?
The president tonight asked that we delay taking up the vote until these diplomatic opportunities are worked through. I think that's somewhat of a moot point. I think it's very clear that the bill would not pass in the House if, at least, unless the president's speech moved a lot of other members, which it didn't do with me, but unless it changed the votes of a lot of other members, it clearly would not pass the House if it were held today, I don't think it would pass the Senate either. So if you wanted it to pass, you wouldn't hold the vote now anyway. But I hope these diplomatic efforts succeed, because frankly, if Assad can dismantle the chemical weapons and we don't wind up engaging ourselves in that war, then I think that's a good result on both outcomes. So I hope that's the case. But even if the diplomatic result is somewhat weak, it's better than I just don't want to see us involved in war in Syria, and I feel very strongly about it.
Congressman, we hear that, and thank you very much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Okay, Larry, thank you.
Thanks very much. Republican Congressman John Campbell from coastal Orange County. And let me also welcome those of you who've been watching from our live video stream. Great to have you with us from our Crawford Family Forum here at KPCC to hear from our guests and soon to hear from our audience members. We're going to hear from you. I just want to ask, just as a courtesy to your fellow attendees and all of us, please no speechifying, and just keep it brief, a question, something to kind of let our guests latch on to our other audience members, as opposed to a passionate 2-minute statement of opinion. Who'd like to say something first? Sir, we'll bring you a microphone so we can all hear you. Please stand up, and your first name. Where are you from, sir?
Joseph from Manhattan Beach.
Great.
I'm curious, Professor
Kaufman.
Kaufman. We're sort of dancing around one issue, which is take Assad out. And, I don't really fully understand why that's not, I don't think it has to be discussed. We did take bin Laden out, and was it really a war, was it?
So is that, you'd like to see him taken out of office?
I don't think anything will change. I kind of agree with Professor Kaufman a little bit. I've got family that goes back there a couple of generations. This isn't going to change. I think he's right about the Russians getting in there and solidifying power, and he is a bad man, and I don't know who's coming next, but what do you think of that?
Objectively, this is not a civil war, so I disagree with Congressman Campbell. There is a cost to not acting. This is a bad situation where we're talking about damage limitation. So our credibility has already been hurt. I think you can make a theoretical case that because this is a regional war and Iran is the greatest danger and Assad is a surrogate of Iran, I'm even willing, in theory, to risk a weak al-Qaeda-dominated Syria as the lesser evil to Iran getting the idea that Syria could get away with this. My concern here is that given what the president intends to do, there are 3 bad options. Doing nothing is a bad option, but the worst option is doing something that is ineffective and convinces the Iranians once and for all, their conviction, if we use a pinprick attack, it will feast on steroids their view that they can get nuclear weapons with impunity, which will trigger the nightmare of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. I'm most concerned about this, and I'm most opposed to President Obama, precisely because I think the course he recommends is the course most likely to damage American credibility, getting the worst of both worlds. The cost of intervention without the benefits.
Not to get lost in the terminology, but just real quickly, you say you don't think it's a civil war.
No, it isn't.
Assad has a lot of supporters in Syria, right?
It's not a civil war, it's a regional war. It's a regional war pitting Iran and its surrogates against Sunni regimes such as Saudi Arabia and the increasingly Islamist
Isn't that
Al-Qaeda.
common in civil wars to have outside parties that are...
But it's beyond a mere civil war.
Okay.
It's now a regional war with a Syrian theater.
Professor Smith.
This is no longer a civil war.
I'm a little amazed that the 2 million Syrian refugees would not quite agree that this is not a civil war. I think to say that it's more than a civil war is saying something else. I will agree with you that it is more than a civil war, but it is at bottom, a civil war. And I think the idea of a weak Al-Qaeda infected state in Syria is a pretty awful evil. I think the unintended consequences of that weak Al-Qaeda state could be quite horrendous. I see lots of routes for lots of paths for U.S. involvement, and many of them could be the result of the U.S. not taking action in this situation and not pursuing the threat of force. I see the problem that I see here is that we face risks of involvement, and we must understand one point that the president made. First, I should also remember that the U.S. doesn't do pinpricks. I mean, that was one point that he made. So we're not talking about a pinprick attack.
Well, can I just interject here? You know, what I was also hearing in that, and the president wasn't, I don't think, wanting to bring this up, that often means civilian casualties. And when you don't do pinpricks, there are innocent people who are going to be killed. How do you deal with the fallout from that if the U.S. is to strike?
Well, I think the possibility of civilian casualties in any sort of military conflict is part of the situation. It's an unavoidable part of the situation. The prospect is attempting to minimize civilian casualties as much as possible. That's what the U.S. military does.
But you know, that's a tough sell, because the emotional impact of seeing Americans inadvertently kill innocent people isn't in the real world contrasted with many more people being killed in that moment. It's in the past or potentially in the future, but you don't have that in the moment contrast. You've got American forces killing innocent people.
Now, you contrast between the popular response to American forces killing innocent people and the accomplishment of a necessary objective. If you perceive it to be a necessary objective, then that's the risk that you take. You can minimize that risk, but that's the risk you take. The only way to avoid that is to never use force.
Let's take another question from a member of the audience. Let's see, right here. Yes, sir, if you could stand and your first name, please.
My name is Walter.
Welcome.
I'd like to address Dr. Kaufman. I totally disagree with him, and my only question is, how are you so sure that whatever the United States orders under President Obama, that it will be ineffective? That's your only argument.
Well, it's an argument based on history and what President Obama has said he is going to do. He's violated every maxim of military strategy. He's told the enemy it's not intended to achieve a decisive result. The target list has leaked. The timing has leaked. The Syrians have plenty of time to move equipment and to embed equipment in civilians. The only thing we haven't done to aid the Syrians is give the Assad regime a luxury hotel on the coast and a bus to wait out a limited attack that is not designed to achieve decisive results. If you look at history, from the Bay of Pigs to Carter's debacle in the desert to Mogadishu, using force without achieving a decisive result has the most negative effect on American credibility, inviting miscalculation. In this particular situation, my main audience is, how will what the president does or not do affect the calculations in Tehran? A weak response is worse than no response, because it will convince the Iranians once and for all that President Obama and the West is not serious, vowing that Iran cannot acquire nuclear weapons.
So do you think Israel then would be likely to step up if that happened, that they would be the ones to take military action against Iran?
No, not necessarily, because Iran has 267 potential nuclear sites, many of them embedded in the Zagros mountain range. The Israelis may do it in desperation, but the United States is the only country with the combination of the resources, variety, and credibility of military options to make a serious attempt at preempting the Iranian nuclear program.
So the scenario that the U.S. military carries out these strikes in Syria, that it does significant damage to the infrastructure of the military there, that it intimidates Assad. He's able to keep power, but his military is diminished. You don't think that's enough to keep him from acting in the future?
Wait a second. You stated as a conclusion what is not self-evident at all. We are not gearing our attacks. Read the interview the president had with Gwen Ifill and Judy Woodruff. Our goal is not significantly to degrade Assad's capability. Our goal is to punish him without in any way threatening his regime or his regime's control.
Is that how you see it, Professor Smith?
Not at all. If you listen to the president's speech, that's not what he was describing. I think there's something we need to keep in mind here. The objective here is not necessarily military success. To talk about military effectiveness misses a point that von Clausewitz made a long time ago. War is politics by other means. The objective is a political objective. And what we're trying to do is alter political behavior. You also heard the president say that we were going to support the non-radical resistance to Assad as best we can. And the president said that in the speech as well. We're not talking about no impact at all on the balance of the situation in Syria. We are talking about no military action.
All right. Something really quick, because I want to take another audience member.
The president had 2 years to help the sectarian opposition, and he's let them languish, which is why they've radicalized to the degree they have in the first place.
But he's drawing that big distinction between chemical and non-chemical weapons usage. And you're saying that's a mistake, I understand. But that's his threshold.
I understand, but
It's an
if
international threshold.
but you have, and I agree with that, but you have radicalized the Syrian opposition by waiting.
All right. I'm sure enjoying this. I hope you folks are too. These two terrific guests. Get a microphone, I think. Yes, you, sir, just...
Elliot Wilson. Would not an attack, a military attack by the United States on Syria, become an excuse for either or Iran and Syria, either or attacking Israel?
Professor Smith.
Not self-evident to me. It's not self-evident to me. It could be utilized by them as a justification for an attack on Israel if they wanted to pursue an attack on Israel, but it does not indicate to me that they necessarily would respond in an attack on Israel.
Professor Kaufman?
I agree with that, and probably for a different reason. One of the reasons that Assad has not attacked Israel is the credibility of Israel's responses in the past, including destroying preemptively the Syrian chemical weapons facility, achieving a decisive result. And the last time the Syrians and the Israelis went at it over the skies of Lebanon in 1982, the score was 86 MiGs down to no Israeli jets down. That's one of the major reasons why Assad is going to take much more seriously Israeli capability without the Israelis having to say anything, precisely because of my point. Israel has a track record of credibly and decisively using force, not just rhetoric.
So you're saying if I'm hearing you correctly, Syria, Assad is, or were you saying Iran?
I am saying Assad wouldn't dare.
Okay.
And
He's
Iran
more
is
afraid,
unlikely to do it.
He's more afraid of Israel's response than the U.S.'s response?
Correct. Because
And you agree with that, Professor
That
Smith?
I agree with.
So
Even
you
with
think
Iran-
Iran too?
I'm not saying it's impossible given the calculations of the mullahs, but right now the Iranians think the possibility of Benjamin Netanyahu responding is substantially stronger than the president's, yes.
All right. We have another member of Congress from our Southern California delegation, Democratic member of the House, Brad Sherman, joining us, his district including Calabasas, West Valley, through other portions of the valley. He's ranking member of the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade. Congressman Sherman, thank you for being with us.
Good to be with you, Larry.
I understand you had a meeting today with the Russian ambassador in Washington, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And so did you come away with a hopeful attitude, or do you think it's unlikely some kind of a deal can be reached?
I'm hopeful, but this is obviously difficult. The key point about this Russian proposal is that even if it's carried out sloppily or not incompletely, it's still much better than we could achieve by airstrikes, even if those airstrikes went completely according to plan.
So sloppily or incompletely, you're meaning that if Syria only did sort of a half-hearted turning over of its chemical weapons, you think that's still better than what the president's contemplating?
Yes, because the president made it plain he was not going to hit the chemical weapons depots. He can't. That would be an environmental disaster. Not only would some of the weapons go into the environment, but if you kill the people who are guarding the weapons, then those weapons become available to some on the rebel side who might very well use them for out-of-country terrorism. So you can't hit the weapons depots. All you can do is degrade the ability to move them around or deploy them. You compare that to any system in which you're able to get 70, 80, 90% of these weapons decommissioned. And that's assuming that the Russian program isn't fully successful and doesn't get all 100%.
So, but let's say it's partial. Let's say that Assad doesn't really intend to turn over everything and Russia doesn't really intend to enforce that. For the sake of conversation, so you get a partial chemical disarmament, then what's to keep other regimes from saying, hey, this is a great strategy. We'll sign on to any kind of a UN or multinational initiative. We'll say we're going to do it and then do it half-heartedly. What's to keep that just from being the norm?
Well, there are a variety of circumstances in the future. Past circumstances illustrate to a greater degree the usefulness of chemical weapons. Egypt used them in the Yemen civil war, and the world didn't respond at all. Saddam used them against Iran, and there are even press reports that we were giving Saddam intelligence that made his use more effective. This red line is you create these chemical weapons, then you face this, this terrible world rebuke. You're forced by your closest ally to give up the vast bulk of what you've created. And not only that, you're deterred from using anything else, because if you do dust off and reach down into the hole and get the chemical weapons that the Russians didn't take from you, you embarrass the Russians, which means you don't do that unless you're in the process of losing and you're desperate.
So you mentioned embarrassing the Russians, but President Putin said today, I'll paraphrase, that this is a non-starter if the U.S. still intends to take military action at some point. That has to be taken off the table if we're going to reach any kind of a deal. So is Russia, in your view, really serious about forcing compliance of this on Syria?
The deal has got to be that we will not bomb Syria if Syria seems to turn over all its chemical weapons and, of course, doesn't use anything that it has left.
Okay, so seems meaning what, that international inspectors would make that determination?
Yeah.
Or okay, so you wouldn't leave this in the hands of the Russian government?
No, this proposal will involve it's not the IAEA, but the similar organization that enforces the chemical weapons ban, to go in there under UN auspices and decommission all of these weapons or take them out of the country. Their goal would be to 100%. They wouldn't stop until they thought they had 100%. And I'm, just because I'm a pretty skeptical guy, assuming that they miss 5%.
Okay, so Is there any role for Congress in this? If Congress were to take a vote on this, and I know the votes aren't there, at least it appears they're not there, to authorize the use of force. But if that use of force were to be authorized, would that give a better chance of signing a deal that really gets carried out?
Well, the president has withdrawn his request, so that was perhaps the most significant line of his speech, and it made perfect sense.
Well, it lets you guys off the hook, but I'm just wondering if the president comes back to you and says, look, I need to have this, I need to have that arrow in my quiver, would you be willing for strategic purposes to give it to him?
Well, I can tell you now that the votes weren't there a few days ago, and the president's speech was well delivered, excellent, comprehensive, and concise, but didn't really convey any information that we in Congress weren't aware of, and that for the most part the American people weren't aware of. So I'm not familiar with anybody's analysis that would say that this would pass the House, might not even pass the Senate. The outcome and the only body to have a vote on it, which was the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, ended up being 10 to 8. That's a terrible showing for an interventionist, internationalist presidential proposal before that committee. That the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate is the most internationalist grouping of members of the House or Senate you could find.
Congressman Sherman, thank you very much. Good to have you with us tonight.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. Democrat representing the San Fernando Valley and is a supporter of this effort to bring an international agreement for chemical disarmament of Syria. Professor Kaufman, what did you think of what the congressman said?
Well, count me as an extreme skeptic of the Russian regime under President Putin. If you look at his track record, this is a man who laments the demise of the Soviet Union as a great tragedy. This is a regime currently trying to intimidate East Central Europe into some type of subservience to Russia. As we speak, Putin has threatened Ukraine for signing an agreement with the EU to make Ukraine more prosperous and more democratic. Putin has blocked any effective action in the UN and otherwise against Iran. He has supported Assad unstintingly. The idea that President Putin is serious about this rather than using this as a ploy to weaken the United States and strengthen an ally, I think is a triumph of hope
Is it
over
possible,
experience.
though, he's using this to make sure that Assad stays in office at least longer?
I think permanently is the operative word. He's using this as a way of protecting Assad from the consequences of his action, disarming the opposition, and consolidating a victory while making Putin the arbiter. And here's the real danger. If Putin gets away with this, he has established himself not only as the arbiter of Syria, but the arbiter of how we handle Iran's nuclear program.
Oh, Professor
That's
Smith,
extremely
you got to
dangerous.
respond to that.
My first thought is to be skeptical because Putin did not need to say anything. The fact that you had from Ambassador Lavrov this response to the Secretary of State that you had, there was no necessity for anybody in Russia to say anything at any point other than to veto any sanction against Assad. So the fact that they did something other than just say no, it constitutes some movement. There must be some purpose here in mind. It may be to make them look like a protector, an avoider of the use of force, the peacemaker. There may be many things involved, but I'm willing to play with that.
All right.
I'm willing to negotiate with that.
All right. We bring a microphone down over to this side here. We have a couple of gentlemen who'd like to ask a question. Yes, sir. Your first name, please. Where are you from?
Stephen from here in Pasadena.
Great.
My question, I guess, it's easy for me to imagine this situation being different if there was a United Nations opposed, standing united against this use of chemical weapons. So I guess my question is, does the UN have any real latitude with things of this nature anymore? Is Russia's influence in that circle undue in a way?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question. Is the United Nations really the enforcer on this, or not, Professor Smith?
As anybody who's worked with the United Nations will tell you, the United Nations is a collection of member states. It is not a separate entity. It is a collection of member states. If there is no willingness of the member states to undertake a specific action, it won't happen. And in fact, the structure of the United Nations allows 5 members to keep the Security Council from undertaking anything. So I think we have sometimes a too hopeful a view of the United Nations. But the United Nations does allow negotiations in situations where negotiations had not been possible before. We have a context within which we can have the kinds of discussions that we're having today. That was not always true. So all we can do is work with the United Nations that we have.
Do you see the United Nations as having any enforcement ability?
On rare occasions, but it's structured for gridlock. There are 15 permanent members of the Security Council, 15 members, 5 permanent. The permanent members have a veto. It's very rare in international politics that great powers see eye to eye on the equities of a situation or the risks run to stop it. The exceptions prove the rule. Korea in 1950 got through the UN only because the Soviet Union was boycotting. Iraq in 1990 was an unusual circumstance, with China being compliant because of the after effects of Tiananmen Square. The French worried about German unification, less willing to antagonize us than usual. The norm at the United Nations on this, on Iran, on most great power conflicts, is that the UN will end up in gridlock. So using the UN for something like this usually is an evasion for action rather than a source of decisive action.
I've heard a lot from our listeners about using the International Criminal Court to bring people in Syria to, I saw your expression, Professor Kaufman. You're a big supporter of the ICC.
No, I'm not. That's an even worse idea, and it's rigged actually to punish the United States and Israel rather than a serious international body, which it's not structured to do.
Professor Smith.
I've spent some time studying the International Criminal Court, and one of the things that you will not get from the International Criminal Court is action while there is still a conflict ongoing.
It's years down the road.
It's that
if ever.
It is as a court, as we see courts make judgments of the crime after the crime has been completed, after there has been an arrest. And the International Criminal Court is structured exactly the same way. It happens after the fact, to the extent that you can get control over those who've acted improperly.
And it's typically after they're out of power, right? That they're no longer in their position to do harm.
There has been one case of a former head of state who was tried, Charles Taylor, and he was sanctioned for things he did while a head of state.
That was Liberia, or where Charles Taylor?
Charles Taylor, yeah, was in Liberia and helped the genocidal forces in Sierra Leone. That's what he was sanctioned for. But again, we're not talking about somebody who's in power.
Okay. All right, another question. Yes, sir. I think you had. We'll get a microphone up up here to you, and then we'll get one on that side of the room next.
My name is Francis. My name is Francis. I'm from Long Beach, and have 34 years of military service. Just recently retired. I agree with Professor Kaufman that the worst option is an ineffective use of military force. However, I'm willing to take the president at his word that the options that they are examining right now will not be ineffective. All to say that he made a comment, and this is the question I have for the two panelists, going back to the United Nations and the Security Council. I think Russia has offered the United States and the rest of the world an out with their offer to negotiate with the Syrians and get this chemical weapon issue under control. Obama said he is going to continue working with the Russians and the Chinese in the United Nations to continue those discussions, hopefully to get a Security Council resolution out. My question to the panelists is, did they miss that, or do they think there is anything in what the president said about bringing China, Russia, and the rest of the Security Council, Great Britain, France, and the United States, to a reasonable resolution? I think Russia, again, has offered the U.S. a way out.
Professor Smith, you want to start?
I want to respond by the statement that Putin made. You quoted Putin's statement with regard to there can be no resolution which does not put away the threat of an immediate threat of an attack, which is what the original French draft had included.
He didn't say immediate. I just want, at least according to the English translation.
He said threat of use of force.
Yes.
This is negotiation. The French came up with one proposal. Putin said what was unacceptable about that proposal. Secretary Perry is going to Geneva to meet with Lavrov in order to continue the negotiation, which is the process of drafting a Security Council resolution. It may not be successful, but that's the most likely path forward, to my mind.
Professor Kaufman, I'll come to you in just a moment, but we're pleased to have Democratic Member of Congress Janice Hanna, the 44th District, Long Beach to Compton area. She's a member of the Committee on Homeland Security. Congresswoman Hahn, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Larry. It's great to be on your show again.
I know it's kind of late there, but thank you for being with us. So I know that you have been a staunch opponent to this point of military action against Syria. Did the president say anything that has softened your view of that or caused you at all to reconsider?
No, nothing he said tonight made me change my feeling that a military strike, is the next course of action that we should take. I have been against that, but I was very pleased to hear him entertain this new diplomatic pathway to a resolution and control of the chemical weapons in Syria. And I was pleased that he is going to ask Congress to delay our vote on authorizing military force to give this diplomatic resolution a chance.
Do you think that it is likely to succeed, or are you skeptical about it having a positive outcome and chemically disarming Syria?
I think it has a great chance to succeed. And I think it does because I now believe the international community will get more involved. Hopefully the United Nations will realize that this is exactly why they were created, was for a situation like this. But basically Russia has offered to be the person that says, we're going to get control of these chemical weapons. Assad has agreed to let us take control of them. So now Russia's responsible for Syria's use of chemical weapons, and I think that puts now them in the spotlight in the international community. And I think the international community will step up and hold him accountable for that.
We heard from Russian President Putin today that he wants any threat of military action under UN Charter Chapter 7 to not be included in a resolution. So do you think that it's still worthwhile doing it if that's the only deal that can be struck, that there is no hammer, so to speak, no enforcement mechanism?
Well, I do. I know there's disagreement with that. I know our President and Secretary of State Kerry believe that the only reason we got to this diplomatic possibility is that we did have a credible threat of military force. But, you know, I'm one of those that believe it's because we've been having this debate in the open and that we didn't rush to judgment that we were able to have this third alternative surface. So, you know, this is negotiation. If that's part of the deal, that we have to take that off the table, I hope we do.
You're our final member of Congress joining us this evening, and I was wondering about the unusual alignment of members of Congress. This is not a partisan divide, and you've got some Republicans with some Democrats on both sides of this issue. How has that been as a member of the House working in that kind of an environment? Is it odd in some ways? Do you see it as positive? What's it like?
Well, it is odd, but I'll tell you, it's amazing that the threat of war has actually brought us together and given us some common ground. And just as we're trying to find common ground in the international community, ever since I've been here for 2 years, I've tried to find little shreds of common ground with the other side, and it's very, very difficult. So it has been actually very satisfying to me as someone who has lived in a political world where, it's about compromise and working with the other side. It's been very satisfying for me to be able to talk to members of Congress on both sides and find some common ground about how the United States goes forward.
Well, it might be too much to hope for that there would be more bipartisan alignments in Congress, but at least it's nice to have something that doesn't just line up cookie cutter along party lines. Thank you, Congresswoman Hahn. We appreciate your being with us tonight.
It's great to be with you again, Larry.
Thanks so much. Represents Long Beach to Compton District in the House of Representatives. And I just want to acknowledge, I know that we had 3 Democratic members of the House, only 1 Republican with John Campbell. We cast a wide net to pretty much every member of Southern California congressional delegation, and so we were able to take those who were able to join us. It was not our intent to unbalance that in terms of party representation. Professor Kaufman, I want to come back to you to give you a chance to respond to what our audience members said about different countries getting involved with this.
All right, one, you had 4 liberals because Congressman Campbell is on the outlier of the Republican.
He's a liberal?
Yes, he is.
He may be surprised to hear himself characterized.
I would tell him that directly. He's been at Pepperdine. The one you didn't have on is Buck McKeon at Figures.
His feelings would be hurt.
Good. The UN is the most dreadful option of all of this. This is going to result, mark my words, in gridlock. This is going to result, mark my words, in setting a terrible precedent of how we deal with the impending gathering danger of the Iranian nuclear program. This template is going to be invoked by Putin and the Iranians to delay, dilute, and render impotent any effective action against the real gathering danger, the most significant problem in the Middle East, the Iranian nuclear program. So I thought the president had handled it badly before. I was wildly optimistic. Now that I know that we're going to the United Nations to deal with this, this is the worst possible outcome, and this will make us even look weaker and less credible than I thought was humanly possible, and I wasn't optimistic before.
All right. We have a question on this side of the room, I think. Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank
yes,
you.
Your first name, ma'am. Where are you from, please?
Yolanda from West Covina.
Great.
I just want to ask the panel, do they think that we're in the middle of a sea change? Because in the past, I don't think we considered diplomacy as a serious option relative to a military strike. So do we see this at least as a sea change, that diplomacy may be considered a viable option?
Yeah, Professor Smith.
I think it's a bit strong to say we've never considered diplomacy. Diplomacy is not something that makes the newspapers every day. Diplomacy continues in a way that the TV doesn't catch, the newspapers don't catch. There's an ongoing workmanlike effort that has been sometimes very frustrating, frequently very frustrating, appearing quite pointless, but it is a very slow, methodic, but frequently useful exercise. Diplomacy goes on all the time.
We don't see most of it,
We don't
though.
see it, but it goes on constantly. And the fact that there was a response to Secretary Kerry's offhand remark by the Russian ambassador is how diplomacy works.
I wanted to ask you about that because it's been characterized as offhand, and I watched as he responded to the journalist's question. It did look offhand to me, but then we heard that the two presidents, Putin and Obama, talked about this at the G summit that they just had a few days ago. So do you think it really was offhanded? Or
I think that in the discussion that the presidents had, and I think Secretary Perry had with Lavrov, both of them may have mentioned the possibility, may have suggested the possibility, but the fact that it gets mentioned in a conversation between two presidents doesn't make it a proposal. And the response by Lavrov turns it into a proposal that might be moved.
Had Kerry not said this, this might not have happened, or at least the timing
I
would
think
have been.
he thinks if he hadn't said it that way, it might not have happened.
Professor Kaufman, what do you think?
Clausewitz said that war is the continuation of politics by other means. Sometimes politics is the continuation of war by other means. And in this particular case, I think the odds are very strong, sadly, that this is an effort not to reach an agreement that President Obama seeks, but a way in which to further Putin's aims to become a kingpin in the Middle East, to protect his patron, and to set a horrible precedent for the Iranian nuclear program. So I am pessimistic, and instead of using the word diplomacy, I'm going to use another word, appeasement. It has very bad history when you deal with dictators.
All right, let the note that eyes rolled with Professor Smith on that for those of you just listening. Let me bring into the conversation KPCC Washington correspondent Kitty Feldy, who's been covering the president's speech and talking with members of Congress. Good evening, Kitty.
Good evening, Larry.
So, there's really heavy lifting that the president's doing here. Members of Congress have been, having all these negative responses from town halls, their constituents. Any chance this is going to change anything?
I don't think so, Larry. And quite frankly, when this Russian proposal came forward and the White House said they were going to consider it, I think you could hear a collective sigh of relief from Congress because you had so many members, particularly on the Democratic side, who were very reluctant to go against their president, but really were having a hard time stomaching casting a vote for military action. So you've got all of these members of Congress. It was very hard to find the few who would publicly say they would support something like that. And so everybody, when this came across today, you could just see, yes, this is a great idea. Yes, we need to try this. Yes, this is the best solution. That was the answer you kept hearing from everyone.
So they're exhaling. They feel, in a sense, they've been bailed out. But what down the road is the fear that you've heard from members of Congress?
Well, it's that trust but verify. Can we trust what will happen? How long will this take? Is this just a flash in the pan, that it's not really a reality that Syria is going to get rid of its weapons? So I think that's what everyone is waiting to see what will happen. But it certainly buys time for the president because, as you've heard from all of our congressional members, there really isn't the stomach on Capitol Hill to go to war again right now. So
what kind of a timeline do you think is going to be required for members of Congress not to get antsy about this? I mean, this could take a long time to negotiate. You think at this point they're just like, we'd rather not have to deal with it at all? Or do you think at some point they're going to say, if there isn't a deal reached, those that support military action, we've got to try and rally this again?
I think that has to come from the White House, quite frankly. I don't think you're going to see anyone on Capitol Hill standing up and saying, well, it's been 3 months and we haven't heard anything on those Syrian chemical weapons, what's going on over there. Congress has quite a bit on its plate right now. Not that it's willing to jump in and tackle things like the debt ceiling or immigration or anything else at this time, but I mean, it's been so interesting to watch, Larry. I mean, Syria has totally sucked all of the energy out of everything else on Capitol Hill. You know, we've only been back officially 2 days. There were a couple of hearings last week. And just the change in the members of Congress it's just been so interesting to watch. You know how when there's a crisis in your family and suddenly all those old disagreements you used to have seem to get put aside so that people can support each other going through the more serious things in life. That's what you kept feeling on Capitol Hill. I can't tell you how many conversations I had with members where, you know, you have this intense eye contact and really serious expressions and a lot of sighing going on. Congress took this very, very seriously.
Will that carry
Really
over
struggled
then?
with it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Will that carry over into some of these other issues, the debate over the debt ceiling and the future of the Affordable Care Act and House efforts to try and defund it? Is there any kind of commonality that's going to come out of this?
Well, the cynic in me would, of course, say no, because what you're going to see being spun tomorrow from the Republican side will be that the president, chickened out, that, he knew he didn't have the votes in Congress, and therefore he won't have the votes on anything else he wants to accomplish. But actually, the thing I would say to look at is whether or not they can come up with some kind of compromise to avoid the debt ceiling. There's some talk that it'll be postponed months, perhaps a year. If that actually happens, that would, to me, be an indicator that the fallout from this Syria discussion has carried on past just Syria.
Well, and maybe they're going to be a little wrung out from this too, because as you say, it's been pretty intense and the stakes pretty high. Kitty, anything else just to add about sort of the mood on Capitol Hill before I let you go? I know it's late there tonight.
Well, the only thing I would say is it was so interesting, Larry, to watch how quickly things changed, and to see how quickly the news changed and how quickly the word got out and how people kept talking to each other. I mean, I've been here almost 5 years now, Larry, and I would say this is the first time I've really seen Congress working, if I can put it that way, the way I always thought it would.
That's a sad commentary.
But you know what I mean. There's so much of what they have to say is posturing and comes from a cheat sheet or a list of talking points. And this was not a talking point issue. This was members talking from their hearts, talking about the conversations they had with their constituents. I mean, it was in that way the kind of Congress we always saw in those Mr. Smith Goes to Washington films. It was very encouraging in that way. And yeah, Larry, I'd like to think it's going to last, but I don't think so.
Well, let's just go to bed tonight with hopeful feelings. We can be skeptical tomorrow. How's that sound? Kitty, thanks very much.
That works for me. You're welcome, Larry.
Kitty Feldy, KPCC Washington correspondent, and thank you very much, Kitty, for joining us tonight. I know we've been going about 90 minutes, but you're all so attentive. You want to do a couple more questions, audience members? Because I think there's still more good stuff for us to talk about. Let's hold it to two, though, just because we don't want to wear it out. Over here, yes, all right. Yes, sir, your first name. Where are you from, please?
My name is Daniel, and I'm from here in Pasadena. We just heard from Kitty Feldy about the mood in Washington, and we heard from the Congresswoman about her ability to connect across the aisle. And tracking Obama's decisions to acknowledge that he has the authority to strike, but to hold off and bring it to Congress for the debate. And then now he's showing us that he's willing to listen to some other option and to hold off and go a different direction. To me, this is a different kind of a dialogue. This is listening. And I'm very aware of all the different political subtext to all of these decisions.
But you're liking what you're seeing from him.
I am, and I'd like to hear your guests comment on that.
Yeah, Professor Smith?
I actually was quite surprised that the president actually came forward to bring this to the Congress. I teach foreign relations law, and one thing I can assure you is the president has the constitutional authority and the authority under the War Powers Resolution to act independently without the approval of the Congress. I think Congress wrote the War Powers Resolution in a way that allows the president 60 days use of force that the president decides to undertake. I think the fact that Obama went to the Congress before moving forward really is quite a different move. That's something that is unprecedented.
So you saw it as strength, not weakness, not that he did it just because he felt he was out there alone.
I'm unwilling to say that he didn't see that the votes may not go with him, but I do think on principle, he's a constitutional law professor. On principle, to go to the Congress was the right thing to do for a number of reasons.
Professor Kaufman.
I disagree. I think he went to Congress out of weakness because he knew he didn't have the votes, and he didn't have any international support. And the idea of, after spending a career of maligning George Bush, who had 46 countries as part of his coalition, and Obama had assembled a coalition of 2, including the French, and couldn't even attract the British. He went to Congress out of weakness and plaintiveness. This is not a principled decision, it's a political one.
Let's, one more question. Let's see, where we have a microphone. I'm sorry, we don't have time for more. All right, we have, yes, sir.
My name is Mike Gerard from Pasadena. For Professor Kaufman, it seems like we're always flitting from one crisis to the other and wringing our hands about whether America's got guts or not. The 2 biggest changes that I've noticed in my lifetime when the Soviet Union went away, which freed Eastern Europe, and the change of attitude of the Chinese government, and it seems to me those are largely brought about by economic forces rather than military forces. Is it possible to contemplate a sort of a firm Fabian approach with regard to this conflict, which you characterize as a regional conflict? Because in 40 years, I mean, time is against countries like Iran. It'll have pumped out a lot of its oil, which is the basis of its economic strength. It'll go back to exporting cashews and whatnot. How could it possibly be a danger that would merit invocation of the Bush Doctrine, which would lead to an actual invasion of Iran?
Professor Kaufman.
2 things. I'm a Cold War historian, and I don't agree with your assessment of the Cold War. American military, diplomatic, and political pressure were essential variables, particularly in the 80s under Reagan, to bring down the Soviet Union. So I don't agree with that. And with regard to Iran, even if you're right in the long term that Iran is doomed, that's often dangerous. Regimes that are radical and fanatical, oftentimes facing windows of opportunity and long-term decline, attempt to leap through them, such as the Imperial Japanese in 1941, such as Hitler, who thought the tide was turning against him. Sometimes the most dangerous things in international politics is precisely that combustible combination of long-term pessimism and a short-term window where you take advantage of a situation that is evanescent. And I see the Iranian regime, quite frankly, as very dangerous in the way in which they calculate risk. It's not like the Soviet Union
Professor
of
Smith.
the 80s.
I'm not so sure that Iran is controlled by the mullahs in that sense, by the irrational mullahs. I think there's a lot of the Iranian population that would like to have a working economy, would like to have a relationship with the rest of the world. And I think over the long haul, we may have a much more useful relationship with Iran. In fact, I'm surprised that we have not tried to talk to Iran about the possibility of constraining Syria with regard to chemical weapons, given Iran's experience with chemical weapons and the new president. That is an option we have not undertaken. That's been suggested by some editorial writers. But I think that we may well have, over the long haul, a much more cooperative Iran. It's just that I agree that desperate regimes sometimes do desperate things, and there could be a lot of danger to pass before we get to the long term.
Before we wrap up, I just want to take a quick vote, and I know this is kind of an oversimplification, but I want to get a sense of where you all stand on things. How many of you support military action against Syria if it does not give up its chemical weapons for destruction? How many of you would ultimately at some point support military action, strikes against Syria? Raise your hand. Okay, so I'm guessing maybe 12 people. How many of you under no circumstances would want the U.S. to take a military strike against Syria? Just think it would be a negative. How many of you would want a military strike, it's about the same number, a military strike if the Assad regime were found to use chemical weapons again? How many of you would support military action? That's the largest group. Interesting. Okay. I want to thank you all very much. Great questions from members of our audience. I apologize we couldn't get more in, but it's been a terrific. And thanks to our guests. You guys were terrific. Thank you so much, Professor Smith, Professor Kaufman. Very much appreciated. And those of you watching on our live web stream, thank you so much for being with us tonight from the Crawford Family Forum at KPCC. Have a wonderful evening. Of course, tomorrow, our coverage continues throughout the day on 89.3 KPCC. Have a good night.